All right, good afternoon. You're in room Augustus 3 and 4 on the Defining the Scope track. And our first lecture will be Morgan Marquis-Boire and CuteCats.exe in the Arab Spring.
So, hello, and welcome to CuteCats.exe and the Arab Spring. My name is Morgan Marquis-Boire, and I work on the Google Incident Response team. Today, however, I'm not here to talk about Google, but to discuss what appears to be the systemic use of phishing and surveillance malware as a means of suppressing dissidents during the so-called Arab Spring. Before I start, I'd like to point out that this is work that I've done mainly with the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco and with the Citizen Lab, which is a human rights, digital media, and global security think tank at the University of Toronto. So, without further ado, CuteCats.exe and the Arab Spring. The title of this presentation refers to a revolutionary wave of demonstration and protest occurring around the Arab world that began in December 2010. And also to a theory developed by Ethan Zuckerman in 2008. So, Mr. Zuckerman postulated that most people are not interested in activism, but mainly use the internet for surfing pornography and lolcats. The tools that are developed for these activities, such as, Facebook, Twitter, Blogger, etc., are nevertheless very useful to social movement activists who lack the resources to develop dedicated tools themselves. So, he then goes on to stipulate that subsequently this makes activists more immune to reprisals by governments than if they were using dedicated activism platforms, because messing with people's cute cats and pornography provides a far greater outcry than shutting down obscure activist resources. So my corollary theory, which is the CuteCats.exe theory of digital activism, which is once a platform attracts a critical mass of activists, that platform will be used to target them. So I'm sure many of you heard people describe parts of the Arab Spring as the Twitter revolution or the Facebook revolution. I don't necessarily agree with those phrases, but they reflect the usefulness of the platforms Ethan Zuckerman describes in the organization of social movements. People that orchestrate surveillance campaigns are also familiar with this idea. And so unsurprisingly, the targeting of dissidents across several countries involved in the Arab Spring, the targeting has played on the usefulness of Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Skype, and other popular platforms. So, as everyone is probably well aware, there has been an extended period of unrest in Syria. Protests began in January 2011 and spread into a nationwide uprising. Since then, the Assad regime has deployed the Syrian army to quell the uprising, besieging several cities. However, as of the present day, this conflict is still ongoing. Shortly before the beginning of the physical conflict, shortly after the beginning of the digital conflict, a campaign was started against the opponents of Assad's regime. While this was not publicly unearthed until 2012, evidence points to this campaign starting November 2011 or earlier. So, around Christmas of that year, a group of activists providing technical support to the uprising were arrested. One of their number remained unimprisoned, received a Skype message from one of his friends who had been captured, advising him to install a useful tool which would enable him to disguise his online identity from the regime's surveillance. Unthinkingly, he installs the software and then realizes upon reflection that this was probably not a great plan. He called to external agencies for aid, and analysis of his machine revealed that he'd been infected with a remote access Trojan, which provided significant capability for surveillance of its victims. It allowed for logging of keystrokes, streaming remote view of his desktop, the ability to watch him through his webcam and listen to him through his microphones, as well as the ability to execute arbitrary programs. In addition to this particular Trojan, the machine was found to have been twice previously compromised several weeks earlier by the same actors. So, analysis of this computer and the malware continued through January, and on February 17th, CNN announced that computer spyware was the newest weapon in the Syrian conflict, and discussed the widespread hijacking of activist accounts and credentials, as well as the targeting of dissidents. Since this article, we have been able to track multiple persistent campaigns targeting opponents to the current regime in Syria. Their preferred methods involve targeting dissidents via Skype accounts of compromised friends, as well as targeting them through social networks used to organize the revolution. So, for instance, Facebook was a platform which was banned in Syria until February 2011. It has many pro-revolution forums and the profiles of prominent members of the Syrian opposition. In early April, the Facebook page of Burhan Ghalioun, a professor at the Sorbonne in Paris, and the leader at the time of the Syrian Opposition Transnational Council, was hit with a phishing attack. This led to his almost 6,000 friends and any visitors to his page being led to this website. So this is obviously designed to look affiliated with Facebook and offers a download under the words Facebook security. Unsurprisingly, this download is malicious software with keylogging functionality. The malware was hosted on this compromised site, which was found to be hosting multiple Facebook phishing campaigns by the same actors, such as this one and this one. And while their campaign is noteworthy, both due to the compromise of Burhan Ghalioun and their terrible ability to mock up Facebook pages that don't look really legit, there have actually been a lot of campaigns hosted on hacked websites that have been documented over the last few months. While we've seen a steady stream of Facebook phishing attacks, we've also seen attacks focusing on Skype and YouTube. So many of you will have heard of the alleged recent suicide bombing of 3 senior military officials in Damascus. This campaign came out a couple of days ago. Emails were sent to Syrian pro-revolution mailing lists alleging that the site contained the final phone call of the Minister of Defense to his wife. It's been made to look like a Skype site, and when you click on this picture, it asks for your Skype credentials. So topical social engineering has been a feature of these campaigns. Earlier this year in March, someone started seeding pro-revolutionary forums on Facebook with these types of messages. It says, urgent and critical, video leaked by security forces and thugs, the revenge of Assad's thugs against the free men and women of Baba Amma in captivity, taking turns raping one of the women in captivity by Assad's dogs. Please spread this. Clicking this link led you to a fraudulent YouTube site. So a noteworthy feature of the Syrian revolution has been its use of YouTube. There have been many grisly and distressing videos posted from the conflict detailing the ongoing violence occurring in Homs, Hama, and other cities. The ability to display to the world the conflict occurring in a country where foreign reporting is largely banned has been extremely important. As you can see, this is a somewhat accurate mock-up of the pro-revolution Syrian channels that have sprung up over the course of the uprising, the major difference being that this site was hosted on the server of a hacked British hosting company. On visiting the malicious website, users would be asked for their credentials in order to be able to post comments, and the site would inform the users that in order to view videos, they would have to upgrade their Flash software. Naturally, this Flash software was malicious, and installed the surveillance malware I mentioned earlier, allowing remote listening and viewing of activities via their computers. This malware was sent data back to command and control domains inside Syrian IP space, and it's worth noting actually that all the campaigns I've documented so far have exfiltrated data into Syrian space, many of them to the same IP address. While this aspect of the campaign is not so stealthy, some of the social engineering employed has been quite compelling. This campaign featured malware which used the right-to-left override trick recently used by the Mahdi malware to masquerade as revolutionary plans for the formation of a high council after the revolution. Naturally, these documents installed a remote access toolkit. However, they also displayed documents to the user which were purportedly intriguing and enticing and likely to be passed about by activists interested in their veracity. Another campaign by the same actors pretended to be a 0-hour plan for the city of Aleppo. Again, the purported documents installed a Trojan, however, they provided extensive documentation likely to be distributed by dissidents among their networks. It's not only political events that have been used for social engineering. Skype is used quite extensively by activists who distrust the country's telecommunications infrastructure. At the beginning of May, it was widely reported that Skype leaked your IP and by extension could potentially allow the tracking of your physical location. Playing on the concern of dissidents, the same actors began distributing Skype encryption software which would allegedly alleviate this problem. Note that this software does not actually encrypt phone calls. In addition to displaying a GUI rife with tragic abuse of Comic Sans, this installs the same surveillance malware discussed earlier. This malware was Dark Comet. This is a remote access toolkit which became associated with the Syrian revolution. Perhaps because of this, the author of it announced a couple of weeks ago that he would stop producing and distributing it. At a similar time, although not necessarily because of this, we've seen these groups in Syria move to the use of Black Shades rat. Since the demise of Dark Comet, we've seen 3 variants of Black Shades in a row used by So I'm really not very inventive when it comes to naming, so I don't have any scary names for these guys. But this group used ALOSH66 as a prefix for 4 of their CNCs. And so, distinguishing feature, predictable C2 naming convention. And they used, while they've been using dark black shades a lot recently, in fact I saw a new sample from them on Monday, they've previously been users of Dark Comet, these people being the same actors who performed the fake YouTube attack that I mentioned earlier. As I mentioned before though, heavy use of Dark Comet has been a feature of the pro-regime electronic actors in this region, particularly these guys. Again, inventive name. I'm not sure whether this group is related to the one I just discussed, but these guys loved using the same C2 address. So early on, they used the domain miru.noip.org, which pointed to 216.6.0.28, which I mentioned because it was actually outed in the CNN article in February. But despite this and the shutdown of their domain, they continued to distribute malware which connected to this address for months. So they were responsible for the campaigns I mentioned earlier involving the fake revolutionary documents, the fake Skype encryption applications, the zero-hour plan for Aleppo, and many more. Syria isn't the only country in this region that has experienced these types of operations though. After the success of the revolution in Tunisia, protests on living conditions began in November in Libya. Protesters clashed with police, attacked government offices, and I think most people know what happened next. The information I'm giving in the talk today is from analysis I actually did for a forthcoming case study being written by John Scott Railton on Libya. So during the uprising, it was alleged that someone had located Gaddafi's hiding place and located it on Google Earth. Having these files suddenly became something that was appealing to many, many people. One of the not completely understood adversaries of the Libyan opposition figured this out and created what were allegedly self-extracting files of these types of data. This malware was targeted at the Libyan opposition fighters using Skype accounts of compromised friends. This particular piece of malware was used to compromise a computer located in one of the key military operations rooms in Misrata where decisions were being made about targeting and military strategy. This malware acted as a keylogger, and the same C2 domain was used as several other samples discovered in this region during 2011. So, Bahrain. Protests in Bahrain started on 14th of February and were initially aimed at achieving greater political freedom and respect for human rights. Unrest continuing to the present day. There's been, imprisonment of human rights campaigners and police crackdowns and so forth. In addition to this, without drawing any correlation, there has been an information operation involving more advanced malware than any that I've discussed today so far. So in a campaign discovered in April of this year, malware was sent to activists via emails, ostensibly from reputable figures containing political content pertaining to the uprising. The samples I've seen masquerade as images or doc files, and when they're opened, they display a picture to the user as expected. However, they also perform additional operations. They install a multi-featured piece of surveillance malware, which allows for the harvesting and exfiltration of many different types of data, including screenshots, keystrokes, Skype calls, and more. It utilizes a virtualized packer to avoid identification and analysis, and contains many tricks to crash debuggers and bypass antivirus software. Data is exfiltrated to an address in a range owned by Batelco, Bahrain's main state-owned telecommunications company. While the malware contained many techniques to frustrate dissection, persistence revealed this. So in the memory space of an infected process, what appear to be debug strings featuring the word FinSpy were discovered. According to documents leaked by WikiLeaks, FinSpy is allegedly part of an intrusion monitoring suite called FinFisher. This toolkit came to public attention after the Egyptian revolution when documents of the state security apparatus were scrutinized. These documents seem to suggest that the Egyptian government had involved in discussion over the purchase of this software. Because it's a turbo talk, I don't have time to go into all the details of this malware or the investigation surrounding it. However, this research has been summarized in a blog post which was released today, which you can read at this link. So, what can we actually do about all of this? So, letting people know that there's stuff going on is really important, which is why you have blog posts. If people know they're targeted, they can do smarter things. If people in general know what's going on, they can be better educated. Also, the theory is that if you know this stuff is going on, you can come to Black Hat, to the security community, and give a talk about it so people that are smarter than you, or well, smarter than me, will think about these problems and come up with creative and novel solutions. So thank you. I'd like to thank these people because they're great. And questions? I don't know who's in charge of time. Do I actually have time for any questions? Okay, cool.
So are these off-the-shelf copies of these rats, or were they custom built for the purpose?
They've all been built by a builder. I can't comment on whether that builder was custom modified or not. So he asked whether or not these were off-the-shelf copies of the rats or whether they've been custom modified for this purpose. So I haven't actually, some of these require purchase, and I haven't actually purchased them, so I can't comment on whether or not. Anyone else? Otherwise, we'll be on good time for the next 2 turbo talks. Great, thank you.
Well, hello. My name is Aaron Leverett, and I'm here to present on the last gasp of the industrial air gap. This is based on some research I did as a master's project at Cambridge under Frank Stiano and John Crowcroft. But it has continued since then, and essentially what I'm going to try and do is convince you that the myth of the air gap is just that, a myth, and that it's not actually helping us when it comes to industrial systems. And I'm going to try and do that in an evidence-based manner, showing you a variety of different systems that can be found on the internet. And if you happen to be a vendor of one of these systems and you're here today, I encourage you to come and find me afterwards because I've baked you lavender scones, because I know this might be a bit rough, but it's all of you going through it and not just one vendor. So here we go. The first myth of the air gap is that it's the default in industrial systems. That's not what I found when I was working for GE or ABB. There are a lot of connections that must be made for updates, for alarms, for all sorts of things on industrial systems. So it's not really the default, and we've been fooling ourselves since about 2006. Another myth is that they're easy to deploy and maintain. That's not actually true. If you have created a segmented network, you have to maintain that over time. And if you merge two companies, you can very quickly discover that that air gap is gone, right? Also the idea that they're cheap, that's again not true because it puts you in competition with your chief financial officers who need data flowing in and out of these organizations to make money in a public utility. And also the idea that they make attacks impossible should be self-evident to everyone in this room. So to disprove this, I have more than 12,000 counterexamples for industrial control systems. So that particular tag at the end is not exact because it can't be, so I'm talking about PLCs, I'm talking about RTUs, I'm talking about uninterruptible power supplies and that sort of thing. And I break them into two categories because HVAC and BMS are considered to be not as critical, or at least not often as critical national infrastructure. I personally don't think that's true, but it's nice to separate them into two categories. So in the second category, I have more than 22,000 examples of HVAC and BMS. And that's over the last 2 years, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how we got those. So we know that networks aren't static, they change over time. That's why it's difficult to maintain the idea of segmentation. And also the idea that it's cheap, it does indeed restrict the business drivers. So You may need data flowing out from a generation plant to say how much electricity is being generated so that the people purchasing that can match it to the demand, right? And that's cross-org info sharing. That doesn't mean that the industrial control system network necessarily needs to share that data, and there's a lot of good ways we can do that, but the first thing we have to do to get there is admit that the air gap doesn't exist. Okay, we certainly know that it's not the best defense. Physical and insider attacks can breach a segmented network. And also, I think that it's fooled us into not doing as much net security and application security because we believed this to be true. And I think that's a shame because even if you do have a segmented network, then you'll need to defend it against some other attack at some point in the future. And it'd be nice if your application security and your net security had been in place as well, right? So how did we do this? You know, you want to ask yourself a question of how many industrial control systems are internet facing. How do you even measure that? How do you go about doing it? And in particular, we have this problem known as the scanning problem in this community, where you run nmap-o on a particular device, which uses non-standard packets, Christmas tree packets, and therefore many of these devices crash. They don't have complete network stacks, etc. So this makes it really difficult when you go into the environment. They say, we don't want you to scan because you're going to crash our devices. But then they assure you that the network is not connected to the internet. And you think to yourself, how can you continually prove this if you're not running any scans? So my answer was to use Shodan because it had just come out at that time. And I was able to find industrial systems devices. And the other thing is I wanted this to be a very repeatable process that anyone in this room could do so that you can go and check this evidence yourself. So most of you will have heard of Shodan, but just in case you haven't, it scans through the entire IPv4 space every 3 months and gives us a sampling, and that's roughly the resolution of that sampling. So I'd like to say thanks to John Matherly for creating that, and it allowed me to write some more code on top of it. He's now added the geolocation that you see there at the bottom in the second tab into the service, but when I first got started, I was doing that on my own based off of the code that he wrote. And then we decompose the banners that we get, looking for known exploits and vulnerabilities. So this isn't zero-day stuff. This is model recon, right? Okay, so mini rant here. Back in 2002, many of you will remember trustworthy computing, right? And I think that was a fantastic movement, and it's kicked off a lot of great work since then. But I find this particular quote a little bit disturbing here in 2012 because we wanted trustworthy computing to be as available and reliable and secure as electricity, water services, and telephony. So by that definition, in my opinion, trustworthy computing is a success because the most popular operating system I encounter in these deployments is Windows 2000. So, you know, I don't have any problems with Microsoft. I think they've done great work, but this is what's running on your public infrastructure, and I think we need to progress that, right? Okay. So how did we know that these things were connected to the internet before we started? And the answer is, I read the manuals. And in fact, you can see right here in this manual that it's run over the public internet. And I wish this was the only example I have of this, but as you go through the manuals of these devices, you find this repeatedly. Some of the vendors are thankfully changing this practice and removing this kind of dialogue from their manuals, product manuals. And trying to look for different approaches. And that's what I'm trying to encourage everyone here to do as well, is have a debate with us about how to do this. Okay, so in the process of gathering all this data that I've talked about, we did some statistics, and we looked at the kind of HTTP use, right? So we'd like to see HTTP 401 authorization on initial contact with any page. Unfortunately, we don't. So, 26% use authentication at the initial stage of connection, right? So not only are they connected to the internet, they're connected to the internet badly. And in the videos I'm going to show you in a moment, you're going to see that. So some of them do authenticate afterwards, so I don't want to give you the impression that this is, a static picture. So you will hit authentication a couple points later. But this is for the initial contact with the page, right? And these pages are predominantly logins or configuration points on these devices. A lot of SCADA and ICS components, DCS, etc., use different protocols. So we weren't really looking at those protocols, right? This is the dumbest way we could do this. I wish that we had used Lambda expressions and something clever to find all this, but no, it was Shodan and strings, basically. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a video, but before we get there, I just want to kind of conclude some of these ideas. And basically, before 0 days are even written, before we write any exploits, we're failing. as nations. And I don't just mean the USA, I mean globally. And it is a global problem, and you see some differences as you travel around the globe, as I've been lucky enough to do. So some countries have better generating capacity in the electric sector, and so they have less issues about reliability in a certain way, and that affects security in a different way. And I love talking about these things, but obviously a turbo talk is a little bit too short. So just to sum things up for you, 22,000 building management systems collected over a two and a quarter year period. That includes HVAC systems and uninterruptible power supplies, things that control doors, CCTV, heating to a building, cooling to a building, water, sometimes elevators, these kinds of things. 12,000 industrial control and UPS, uninterruptible power supply systems and devices. UPS systems are considered to be, not very critical. However, they can be the backup for a hospital or data centers. We often find them in data centers. And while it might not be critical national infrastructure, you can do quite a lot of damage to a data center by playing around with the power supply. So these can be found in Showdown's results, right? This isn't clever stuff. This is Showdown, right? 52 queries. So I'm not even completist. This is just a rough sampling, a rough idea. Only 26% with the HTTP response of authentication, which is what we would really, really like. 53% had remote vulnerabilities in ExploitDB and Metasploit. So again, I'm just doing database lookups. I'm not even doing any analysis of the software itself. I don't pull local exploits because I already have trouble sleeping at night. So I just look at remote because it's kind of more meaningful. And default passwords and help files on the web page, I find that a little bit disturbing as well when you're talking about manufacturing infrastructure. And I just want to make this point. Passwords in 2012, right? For your critical national infrastructure. Does that bother anyone in here? Bothers me. So let's break out of this, and a lot of you will be here to see the tool that I actually wrote and what we can do with it. So let me show you some building management systems in a little video here. So you can see we're clicking on individual links. This is the visualization I created in my dissertation. And that takes us to the geolocated device. That geolocation might not be terribly accurate because it was passive, but you can do active geolocation down to 590 meters. As that gets down to about 200 meters, it becomes really scary because you can infer the use of the device. You can see a little window there in the middle as I scroll along. So the results are appearing and disappearing based on the 3-week window that they appear in Showdown. You can see that we've stored the known vulnerabilities in that data. So this is for Daffy's department store. This is a Taxenta. Okay, it's not critical national infrastructure, but it's a store, and you have some access to the building management system of that store. And this is an nylon controller, sometimes used in lighting. This is from a company called Tritium. Billy and Terry did some great work on this recently. You'll notice that it's attached to a university. And we can go in and have a look at the page, and here we have MD5, client side, as the authentication for a building management system. Now you might think, university, so what, no big deal, that happens to be near here. Turns out this university is teaching nursing and doctoring, and so I consider that to be kind of serious stuff, even though it's just a building management system. So moving on from Tritium, because it's not just one vendor, it's many vendors. Here we have Siemens with their OZW775. Another controller, I found one of these in Cambridge that was controlling the sprinklers to a library that had 17th century manuscripts. You can see that this has alarms unauthenticated, so we get some idea of the data. And here's another building management system. The last 3 of these were sent to me anonymously by someone I like to call a concerned citizen, so thank you to him for sending those. I mean, I assume it's a him. So that's the video of building management systems, but I'm sure some of you are probably more interested in industrial control systems. So like I said, that was the less serious stuff from my point of view. So let me give you another little tour. This is the same visualization, but this time I've changed the map a little bit. So these are different queries, right? These are focused on PLCs, RTUs, this kind of stuff. And as you can see, global problem, right? So the red nodes denote known remote exploits or vulnerabilities, and the green no known at that time, which of course doesn't mean they're safe. For example, I believe Tritium may be having some trouble with some issues at the moment that haven't been published yet. Look, I've weaponized it. You can go to the link, click on it, have a look at this particular device. I believe these are controlling water treatment plants in Ireland. I don't trust the code, so I have to allow it to run. You know, this is clever SCADA stuff, right? It doesn't involve any web knowledge. You can see the admin user account is already enabled. Some of you may know a bit about, I don't know, PHP and so on. You might be able to find vulnerabilities in these devices with that sort of knowledge, if only you knew about them. This is a meter. You can see the password protection is disabled. This is a Moxa serial device server. So these are Ethernet to serial converters. They disclose quite a lot of information, again, without any authentication. I want to make it clear I never attempted authentication with any of these devices. If presented a prompt, I stop. So basically, I'm web browsing, right? That was an industrial Ethernet switch. This is another type of device. Justin Clark found a backdoor in this device using the MAC address to calculate a password. That wasn't informed, or the customers were not informed of this, and you can see the MAC address published on the page, right? Yay, we have to authenticate. This is one of the good ones. Siemens Sematic, as you know, looked at by Billy Rios and also found by Professor S on the web. So an HMI is a human-machine interface. It's basically the display to the user control engineer. This is an Allen Bradley PLC. Again, as I said earlier, I don't trust other people's code, so I'll have to allow this to run. But for your pleasure, for your viewing pleasure, we'll run it. So you can see there's a bit of information disclosure about network and configuration and so on. And then, yay, we're presented with authentication. That's great. That's a good start. And again, I don't want to pick on any particular vendor. You know, here's Schneider, because this is broadly the practice of an entire industry. And I think it's not really fair to just go after Siemens or any of the others. This particular device is showing a view of a facility in Germany. I don't know why. And this is another example of the device. These are found more often in Europe. This is another reason to do this work globally, because you find some devices used more heavily in certain countries and certain sectors than they are in other countries. So you learn quite a lot about that. And finally, at the end, I won't say who the maker of this is, but you can see the stuff written at the top is, I believe, Turkish, and we translated it just to see what it was. And it has the very comforting phrase, mineral resource drip remote monitoring system. You know, I don't know about you, but I'm slightly uncomfortable with these things being on the web using HTTP. So that's my talk. And if you have any questions, then please come and find me later. And as I said, I have baked some lavender scones for all the people featured in this video. And I mean you no harm. We just need to improve things. That's all I'm trying to say. Do I have time for questions or no? 6 minutes? Yeah? Okay. So I guess I do have time for a couple questions. I'll take more later if you want to ask me privately. But if you have any public questions, go ahead. Go ahead. So the question is, can we determine intentionality in the devices that we found? And, you know, meaning, did they mean to put it on the web on purpose, or was it accidentally exposed in some way? And the answer is, we can tell to some degree. So for example, if it's got a host name, which you can see in showdown results, then you know they kind of did it on purpose, right? Occasionally, when you're looking at a device, you can see that it's got a local IP address, and then you know that it's been taken through a firewall, you know, on the config page. But we can't do that uniformly across all this data set. So it's really difficult for me to turn around and say 30% of these were on purpose and 70% weren't. However, in individual cases, you can see that, right? In my opinion, a lot of these were put on the internet on purpose, but without really realizing the risk that they were putting their business or organization or whatever to. A lot of times in process control environments, the goal is to keep the system up and running at all costs. And there's not always thought about the longer term consequences. Although I find these engineers to be very clever and very caring about lots of important stuff, this is new to a lot of them. Question?
Why do you think more in this day and age, take security works like CNA
Right. So the question is, why do some of the big companies not take security more seriously? I think they're beginning to, and I'm seeing evidence of that, and I'm very pleased about that. But that's one of the reasons I'm here today to talk about the Airgap. I used to work for GE Energy in quality assurance, and I did a bunch of work for them and enjoyed it. And one of the things I came across was, let's do some security testing, right? No, we don't need to. It's never touching the internet for 5 years. And then I got tired of that, and it was time to progress things. So my point is, the engineers wouldn't let them scan, so you didn't necessarily know what your assets were. That made you blind. Then the vendors truly believed that no one was ever putting their stuff on the internet, even though they were creating web-enabled embedded web devices and so on. They truly believed that, right? And it's this kind of crazy schizophrenia I'm trying to combat. And so because they believed that, they didn't spend as much time doing security engineering, which we'd like to see, right? Any other questions? So the question is, did I look at companies that integrated with government power grids and so on? So some of the uninterruptible power supplies could be related to government buildings. It's hard to tell, especially when I've just got like IP address and host name and so on. So I didn't go specifically after any companies that did that. Like I said, I'm trying to paint a picture of the industry as a whole instead of picking on anyone. But we could. And certainly, from the Washington Post article about Billy Rios and Terry McCorkle, it looks like tritium products are used kind of widely in government circles. But I mean, industrial systems are used by everyone, right? Government included. So, and even 2006, I was just reading an Army manual about securing industrial systems. In 2006, it was all EMP shielding and protecting against surges and RF protection and all this kind of stuff. Make an air gap was pretty much the only digital security step in there. So even 6 years ago, this was considered best practice by the Army, right? So, does that answer your question, though? Yeah. No, and in fact, if I have the chance to inspire people to do something with Shodan, please do, because you could look at financial companies, you could look at almost whatever you want in there, and it's a little bit of a snapshot of the internet. What do hackers fear most? Getting caught in a log somewhere so that someone comes and knocks on their door. One of the things I like about Shodan is it kind of reverses the problem. Companies and governments and so on can now get caught in a log somewhere, and we can show what's going on. So yeah, you could look at financial companies if you wanted to. Any other questions? I think I've used up my 6 minutes, so thank you very much again.
Where is the plug? Am I missing the plug here? Where'd you put the plug? Paul? Do you know where it is? Saw one was up here earlier, but now it's DB25. There, drop down. Thanks. Cool. Excellent. Good afternoon. I'm Sean Barnum with MITRE Corporation, and I'm going to be talking with you this afternoon about an ongoing community effort known as the Structured Threat Information Expression, or STIX. And in the short time I have with you, I'm going to try and give you a quick introductory overview of what this effort's about, kind of where it's going, with the hopes of at least informing you of what it is, its relevance, and really inspiring you to maybe dig a little bit deeper if this is something that's relevant for you, and have you become part of the community and part of the conversation, because that's what this is, definitely a community effort. So to start out, or actually I should say, if you were in Sean Henry's keynote this morning, I didn't talk to Sean ahead of time, but his talk was about as perfect of a setup for what this is targeting as I could have possibly dreamed of. So you'll see a lot of parallels with what this effort is looking to do and some of the key drivers with the stuff that Sean talked about this morning. So to start with a little bit of contextual background, Much of this will be kind of in the obvious realm, but I think it's important to set the context for what's driving this effort and what the key objectives we're trying to reach and the things that are going on. So anybody who's playing defense in the digital domain is familiar with that frustrating feeling of kind of fighting an ongoing, never-ending losing battle against an adversary that you kind of is out there and is outgunning you. That situation is getting worse day by day as the threats continue to become more diverse, to evolve in capability, evolve in number. So that's kind of a never-ending problem that we're facing. We really need to find ways to kind of turn that paradigm. At the same time, traditional approaches to defense that are inward focused, looking at the defenses we have in place, looking for vulnerabilities in those defenses wherever they might be and try to patch and mitigate them as much as we can, is necessary, but it's also insufficient. We can never become 100% secure. In the limited time, the limited resources we have, we need to make sure we're making more strategic and better decisions on how we actually look at that defense. So really what it requires is a balancing outward focused view. We need to actually understand the adversary. We need to understand the behavior, their capability, their intent, how they view our defenses, how they interact with our defenses such that we can make more strategic decisions. So kind of a balanced inward-outward focus. Excuse me. At the same time, today we're finding the sort of complex attack chain, so kill chain type view of attacks that in the past have existed for over a decade with the APT type actors, and were very rare in the past. Today are much more commonplace. We're seeing these sorts of attacks, complex attacks occurring within cybercrime, within activism, with lots of other places. And unfortunately, kind of our traditional view for dealing with these sorts of complex attacks is very much kind of left of the, or right of the exploit. We're really in an incident response kind of capability. That's the visibility we have. That's the sort of ability we have to do courses of action. And unfortunately, while that's necessary, again, it's also insufficient because to some degree, by that point, the horse has left the barn and we're just trying to gather up what we can to save it. But we need to find a way to try and find, again, a balance on the other side. Oops, I went backwards. A balance on the other side to have visibility and take courses of action left of exploit. How do we actually have that cyber threat intelligence, that view of what's going on with the adversary, what sort of behaviors they're doing, how do we predict them, how do we see what's going on and make courses of action and determinations earlier in the kill chain. So balancing that proactive and reactive. So to do all these sorts of things, to have that sort of visibility early in the kill chain, to be able to balance inward and outward focus and understand the threat actors and make strategic decisions rather than just tactical and responsive decisions, really it calls for a need for holistic cyber threat intelligence. So this is the stuff that Sean was talking about this morning. So how do we move from a reactive status to a more intelligence-driven status that we can understand the adversary, take strategic actions, understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, detect the early stages of it, and these sorts of things. And threat intelligence is not a single-player sport. There is no organization who has adequate information to give them the situational awareness to make those sort of determinations on their own. So really what we're looking at is the ability to share overall context and share among trusted partners and communities. And it's not just one community, it's each player may play in multiple different communities with different levels of trust, sharing different sorts of information. But that sort of paradigm is very important because my detection today of something that just happened to me could become your protection tomorrow. If I share that to you, you can actually avoid it reaching the exploit stage in the kill chain for you. So information sharing is an absolute core component of enabling this. And to do that sort of information sharing at scale, at machine speeds, to do this sort of complex cyber threat intelligence requires automation. There will always be a human in the loop. There's always people that are focused on making decisions, interpreting the deep stuff. But as much as possible, we need to allow them to use their limited cycles to focus on those tough, deep analysis questions, making determinations, and as much as possible, offload the busy work of transforming data, looking for certain patterns of data, those sorts of things that can be automated. And all this together, if we're going to do this sort of automation, we're going to do this sort of complex sharing, if we're going to do this sort of information and cyber threat intelligence, it really calls out for a need for a standardized representation for what we talk about when we say threat. And there really does not exist such a representation today uniformly, and that's what STIX is targeted at doing. If we take a look at the information sharing component of that, this sort of information sharing of cyber threat information, and especially indicators, is nothing new. This has been going on for years among different communities. But typically that sort of information is very atomic and very limited in expressivity. We're talking about things like IP lists. Here's a list of 10 IPs that we know are bad, or file hashes, or URLs, or maybe email addresses. So little bits of the overall problem that are something you see this, you might worry, but they don't really give you depth. So a file hash just tells you the hash. It doesn't tell you anything else about the file. It doesn't tell you the context of why you should be concerned with these sorts of things. So they have existed, this sort of sharing, but it's very limited. At the same time, most of the sharing that does exist today is typically human to human in nature. So it's analysts in one organization communicating with analysts in another organization, usually in an unstructured fashion. So this is typically done with web-based portals or encrypted email. So in a portal sense, it's things like US CERT creating a all-caps PDF alert document, throwing it up a portal, and other people coming and pulling it down. From an analyst to analyst perspective, it might be two different partners within a community, one of them writing up an email, and in the body of the email just saying, hey, we saw this kind of C2 activity occurring and this sort of thing, you might want to look for these. And it's sent email back and forth. So again, there's some limitations to what you can actually get out of that sort of approach. There are some more recent trends towards machine-to-machine interactions, but again, it is typically very limited in expressivity, and it's usually focused on known attack patterns of things that are occurring. So what STIX aims to do is to extend indicator sharing so that we can manage and exchange much more expressive indicators that give you much more context and allow you to make strategic decisions on those, and not just indicators, but also going beyond indicators to do other cyber threat information as part of this overall picture. So that's really what it's targeted at doing. So how did we actually get to this? How did it evolve? How did STIX as a standardization approach evolve? It really started about 12 years ago with the CV, which I'm sure most of the people in the room are here familiar with, which was an attempt to try to standardize how we identify and reference publicly disclosed vulnerabilities in packaged software. So how do we do that? So there's a standardization efforts on the vulnerability side. That's great from an IT management perspective. Do I have software deployed in my environment that has these sorts of issues? How do we do those? That evolved into the CWE, the Common Weakness Enumeration, which is an abstraction off those vulnerabilities to what are the weaknesses and characteristics, the things that were done in software systems and networks that could actually lead to vulnerabilities. So in this way, we could identify this sort of stuff, mitigate it, and hopefully prevent it before it ever becomes something that shows up in CVE. That in turn led to kind of that balanced inward-outward focus, an outward focus in a standard called CAPEC, which was a way to characterize common attack patterns, or the way that attackers viewed the systems and what sort of weaknesses they would go after, what the sort of actions they would take. So that's the kind of initial balance, and that was the initial piece of the standardization kind of on the threat side, and that occurred about 6 years ago, first came out, it's still out there right now. But those sorts of patterns are inherently abstract, and there's a need to get a little more detail and actually also characterize automation of attack, and that led to a standard called MIC, which if you're familiar here is a language for characterizing malware behavior, so describing how malware acts. And CAPEC and MIC both together kind of started to flesh it out, but they actually had an underlying need as part of what they were doing to have a standardized representation for this concept of cyber observables. So what are the events or the stateful measures in a cyber domain, things like file hashes or an event like an HTTP GET being received? These sorts of things are absolutely core to being able to describe the actions of malware. They're also important if you want to adorn attack patterns and you say an attacker does a certain step, what would that look like in the real world? So out of this grew a standard called CyBox for representing cyber observables in a standard way. CyBox has been used for those uses. It's also currently a key piece of an ongoing effort to standardize digital forensics analysis results of these observables and using that as a piece. And then it also really is kind of the key piece of when we talk about indicators and threat indicators. A threat indicator is saying when you see this, it indicates something else. So it became this evolution of saying, okay, well, if we have a way to describe observables, what we really need to do is be able to exchange threat indicators and what those observables mean. Well, unfortunately, there really wasn't a standard way of doing this. There are some different things that fit different parts of the puzzle, but there really wasn't a way of doing this. This led a community of threat intelligence and incident response experts who interact on a list called IDXWG. It's been around for about 2 years. There's about 200 plus different practitioners that are part of this community, to begin working about 6 to 9 months ago on trying to work to standardize some sort of representation for indicators. And one of the first things they decided is if we're going to talk about indicators and it's about observables and the meaning, why don't we start by basing this stuff on top of CyBox? So let's use CyBox as the foundation for the observables, and then let's all talk about what the other stuff needs to be, the context. What does this observable mean? What is the handling guidance? How do I provide you all that other layer of information? And they quickly came across the first challenge in that among this diverse set of experts, there was no common consensus on what an indicator was. Some communities, some organizations feel that an indicator is literally those atomic things. That here's an IP address, here's a file hash. Other communities share much more rich things. They actually say, here's the observable, here's the piece of malware that I found it's in relation to, we've seen it as part of this campaign, we think it's part of this threat actor, we saw it in these incidents at this organization, so much more rich stuff. And so as we try to work as a community to try to define a common representation, we were spinning ourselves around an axle because we couldn't come to an agreement on what we were standardizing. So the community went through several iterations to try to define what is in scope for an indicator and what is out of scope for an indicator. And from those iterations, we came to a clear consensus of the minimal set of things that were part of an indicator and all the stuff that was outside. But in that discussion, we discovered that all that stuff that was outside was very important for what's inside the scope. And so we began to have the discussions about framing how all those different pieces fit together in an overall cyber threat information architecture. And so that out of scope for indicators led to the stuff around indicators and defined an architecture. And that architecture evolved into being what is today STIX. So that's kind of where it came from a history perspective. So what is STIX? STIX is a language. It's not a policy. It's not a program. This is not somebody saying how you should do things from a cyber threat intelligence. It's not telling you what you have to share. It's not government sucking up data. It's purely a language for specifying, capturing, characterizing, and communicating cyber threat information. So it's a language that can be used for all those things, but it's up to you how you want to use it. It's purely the information layer of describing the things that you want to talk about. It is community driven. It's not a commercial product vendor building something and telling you this is the right way to do things. It's not a government group going into a back room and coming up with the way you're supposed to do things. This is a community of people within industry, within government, within academia, both nationally and internationally, who are part of this discussion. And really it's targeting, trying to get consistency and clarity when we talk about cyber threat information, and ultimately lead to the ability to automate many of the things that we're talking about. So one of the key points that Sean mentioned this morning is if you want to act at machine speed with this sort of information, you cannot possibly do that without automation. And so this is trying to enable that sort of automation. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on the use cases. This is a very, very high level of use cases that STIX is looking to target. Many of these different key bubbles can be drilled down very deep. But really, overall, what it's trying to support is cyber threat analysis. So how do actually the cyber analyst, looking from data coming in from shared communities, from the operational space, from the sensors that are out there, how do they make sense of what's going on? How do they understand what campaigns may be going on, make determinations of meaning, identifying key things you might want to look for in an operational context, all of that sort of activity, feeding into identifying indicators. So here's something that's of use and here's why it's of use. Those indicators feeding into the actual cyber threat detection capabilities within an organization, which may lead to incident response, but also sharing other courses of action that may be preventative in nature. So if we have that ability to see the full picture, we may be able to identify things pre-exploit in the kill chain. So that sort of information. Those indicators not only go inside the organization, but they can also go to a use case for sharing. And there's some cyber decision makers who come into play, defining policy of saying, of all the stuff we know, what do we want to share with who, and how do we actually reach trust arrangements with those organizations, and how do we define what they're allowed to do with it. So all of these sorts of use cases together is the aggregate that STIX is looking to try and support. Not only each piece of these use cases, but as an integrated whole, how they fit together so they can work together in a coherent fashion. So to do that sort of across use cases, there are some guiding principles. First and foremost is expressivity. So we're trying to find ways to express all the things you're going to want to describe to support those use cases. That can lead to initial reactions sometimes that something's very big and complex, but there's a balancing principle, which is flexibility. Everything in the language is optional. So for any given use case or any given instance of a use case, you can use whichever elements are relevant and use only those, or whichever ones you don't want to. Wherever possible, there are adequate consensus standards for representations that need to be there. We try to integrate those in, so we integrate in a wide range of different standards, including many of the ones I just named in the history of this stuff. There are extensibility points built in so that we can actually grow this stuff going forward, so it can be used in specific domain use cases and things like that. It's obviously built for automatability, and as much as possible, the language itself, not the content of the language, but the language is built in a way to try to be readable and understandable rather than overly complex for people, since this is in an emergent stage as we're trying to discover the things we know and we don't know and pumping real data into it. So, I'm not sure how readable that is, but the architecture as it exists today, so what is STIX? Today it consists of an architecture of 8 key constructs. Kind of the most obvious of those is incident. So this is the foundation of most traditional security operations and this sort of thing from a threat perspective. So incidents being able to capture the description of what's going on, the location of effect, the related indicators that may have led to it, what sort of TTP and actions were being leveraged, the intent, impact, courses of action, these sorts of things. Another key construct is this idea of indicator, which led to this architecture. It defines valid time windows, certain observables that you're looking for, and then also the context for those observables, what sort of TTP may be associated there. You can assign certain indicators and adorn them with kill chain references for where that's done. You can also capture inside of here structured mechanisms for testing for these sorts of observables. So if there are observables dealing with network type stuff, you can do snort signatures, URS signatures, oval, whatever you want inside of these things. It's also about, obviously, the observables. It's about TTP, so a common structure for describing this concept that's been around for a long time of TTP. But whether that be behaviors in the form of attack patterns, malware, exploits, whether that be resources and the tools that are used by an adversary, whether it's the infrastructure being used, targeting information, who are they going after, is it certain individuals, organizations, certain kinds of information systems, all the sort of thing, as well as references to what sort of exploit targets they're looking to affect. So that's the other key one of the other key constructs here. So from a vulnerability perspective, is it CV references OSVDB? We also incorporate CVRF, so you can actually define 0 days and other things that haven't been reported. Weaknesses, configurations, and then references to potential courses of action. So how do we have a common structure for representing courses of action, whether those be remedial in nature, so how do we remediate certain vulnerabilities or mitigate weaknesses, these sorts of things, but also maybe response in type from things like incidents. So, describing the actual course of action, the objective, the impact, the cost, the efficacy, as well as possibly capturing structured representations of those. Goes beyond that to actually look at the higher levels of threat intelligence. So the ability to characterize campaigns. So if we look to see what is the common intent, so common incidents, indicators, TTP that we're seeing occurring with the common shared intent typically from a shared threat actor, how do we define that intent? What sort of TTPs are associated with these campaigns, incidents, indicators, attribution to threat actor, this sort of thing. So also the ability to characterize threat actors, where those are specific threat actors or by profile. How do we characterize what sort of intent they share, what TTP have they leveraged in the past, what sort of incidents and campaigns have we associated with them, all this sort of information. So you see there's lots of these different pieces, and then you can see how they're all related to each other to some degree. And when we try to talk about this stuff to either C-level executives or to some degree when Sean was talking this morning, he was talking about some key questions we need to answer as part of cyber threat intelligence, and different pieces of this construct actually address different answers, different questions. So observables help us define what we're looking for. Indicators basically tell us why we should care about those things we're looking for. Incidents tell us where they've been seen before. The TTP structure allows us to say exactly what was the adversary doing. Exploit target allows us to say what were they going after and looking to attack. Campaigns tell us why they were doing it, what were they trying to do. The threat actor tells us who was doing it. And the courses of action allow us to characterize what we should do about it. So it's these different dimensions to this overall puzzle as an integrated whole and an integrated architecture for this sort of information that STIX is looking to try to provide. So beyond the architecture, there has been an initial implementation using XML schema, not as an assertion that that's the way that everybody should build things, but it is ubiquitous, it's portable, it's structured, and allows us to define all the concepts that typically people talk about but may not really be thinking about in the same way, to provide a concrete straw man for actually structuring. When we talk about handling guidance, what does that mean? How do we actually structure what we need to? So it provides that straw man that we can all talk about things and refine and build on things. It also provides a practical structure for early real-world prototyping and actually doing proof of concept implementations. And there are several of these that are ongoing right now for doing this sort of a thing as well. Overall, we want to plan and iterate to use real-world data, discover where there's gaps, discover where we need to refine and fix things. Can you do that? Eventually, when we reach a point of stability, we will abstract from that XML implementation and define a specification that is independent of that specific implementation. And then that specification could then be drilled down into various other implementations, whether those be semantic, RDFL, whether they be JSON, whether they be protobuf, thrift, whatever else you might want to do. And as long as those are based on the same semantic specification, they should be interoperable with minimal transform between them. So depending on what sort of protocol stack, what sort of technology stack you want to go with, you could actually do this. So adoption and usage, this is still early. So I said 6 to 9 months ago is when we started talking about indicators. STIX as an actual implementation has only been around 2 months. I just received public release to talk about this last Thursday. But even in that short amount of time and the level of maturity that's reached, it's had extensive interest, in fact, almost universal positive reaction from broad communities. And it's actually currently being used as many different things. So DHS has a program called TAXI, the Trusted Automated Exchange of Indicator Information, that's looking to be a set of protocols, specification of protocols and APIs for the pipe to exchange this sort of information. So organizations that want to share it can actually have a protocol defined between them, and then everybody can share in the way they want to do. And it's based on STIX. The U.S. CERT strategy for how they handle incident response and threat data and how they share it out is currently based on STIX, and they're looking to integrate it further into what they're doing. The FSISAC, the Financial Services ISAC, about a month and a half ago announced that they...
If you gave me a $20 donation and I bought beer, I would tell you that. You know, and if that encouraged you to not donate again, it's something we'll live with. Yeah, that's the thing. We'll tell you exactly what's going on, and we'll live with the consequences. Any other questions? I will be here all week, so if you don't want to embarrass yourself or you have a fun question that needs more discussion, track me down. I'll be here for the next few hours. I will be at B-Sides all day tomorrow, and I will be at DEF CON up till Sunday afternoon or so. Until then, expect us eventually.